All right, so weekly production meeting. Let's quickly review some old business. Item number 1. Starting this week, we will reduce Fancy's paycheck by $5 a week so we can buy the good Entenmann's donuts instead of the store brand.
Objection.
Yeah, your objection is noted. Oop, Steve's got to run to the bathroom. Okay, item number 2. No eating other people's sandwiches from the refrigerator. If it has somebody else's name on it, do not eat it. I'm looking at you, Fancy. And finally, new business. We heard back from our special effects team. Yes, they sent us a new animatronic. Now, I was initially kind of disappointed because he doesn't seem to do anything, but they tell me that, once again, it's just a matter of pressing the activator pad, which in this case is not in his paw, but is located in one of the plates on his back. So, I'm going to reluctantly give this a try. So, here we go. Hello, and welcome once again to Spooky Tales with Steve the Cat, your place for fun reviewing horror movies. I am your host for this evening, Carl the Camera Monkey. Steve the Cat is indisposed. So, we've got a couple of really good movies to talk about tonight, but before we get into that, we've got some housekeeping to talk about. Specifically, we've got a new cast member here at Spooky Tales with Steve the Cat. So, if you tuned in last week, you saw this guy arrive in the mail. This is a new animatronic prop from our special effects shop. Now, we had hoped for something lifelike and adorable. Jury's still out on whether this is either of those. Initially, I was concerned that he doesn't seem to do anything, but it turns out that once again, you just have to press the right spot to activate the animatronic effects. So we have turned him on, and turns out he's actually very interesting. I'm going to let him introduce himself.
I am Dr. Edgar Fluffosaurus, Professor of Monsterology at George Mason University. I am the recipient of the prestigious Raymond Burr Award for Lifetime Achievement in the fields of kaiju studies and lyrical dance.
So, you know, here at Spooky Tales with Steve the Cat, we're not filmmaking professionals. We're just enthusiasts, so we learn new stuff every week just like the rest of you. One thing that I did not know until this week is that every animatronic ever used in the history of filmmaking has been a vessel holding either a disembodied spirit or a demon. That explains Fancy the demonically possessed animatronic. But did you also know that Bruce, the animatronic shark used in Jaws, was actually a vessel holding the spirit of a 12th century Scottish monk, one who coincidentally was terrified of water. That's why the animatronic was always broken. The giant bat that was used in Fright Night holds a demon named Heinrich, the goat hugger. Not exactly sure what that's all about, but that's who it is. And finally, we have the disembodied spirit of Professor Edgar Fluffosaurus here on staff with us. So, there you go. The good news is we now have a professional monster expert on staff. So we'll be letting Professor Fluffosaurus host a little segment of the show later on. But for right now, let's get to our movies. All right, it's time once again for Steve's vocabulary lesson. This is the part of the show where we investigate new and dynamic usage of the English language and creative words in an effort to stay ahead of social media bots and algorithms that would otherwise try to ban us. It's a short lesson this week, just one word. The word for this week is ensnappinate. This is a verb, meaning to quickly rotate a character's head by 180 degrees while leaving the rest of the body in its original orientation. Now, colloquial forms of this word include hoot owling and Linda blaring. Now, I think this one's pretty easy to understand, but just in case I have diagrams. So, here's the before diagram. Here's the after diagram. So after the ensnappinating you have on the right, before the ensnappinating you have on the left. The most famous example of ensnappination for me comes from one of the early episodes of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I believe it was in the second season. It was when Angel went bad and became Angelus, and he gave a good hoot-owling to Giles' girlfriend, Jenny Calendar, and it was very tragic. But anyway, that's Steve's vocabulary lesson for this week. Now, the reason we have a short vocabulary lesson is because, well, we're doing a creature feature, and it occurs to us that we now have a professional monsterologist on staff, so we're going to be debuting a new feature right now called Monster Chat. So here we go. Enjoy the first episode of Monster Chat.
Hello, and welcome to Monster Chat. I am your host, Professor Edgar Fluffosaurus. In tonight's episode we take a closer look at vampires. Vampires are a small species of kaiju native to Guatemala and New Zealand. They have 2 heads, 6 arms, and breathe fire. Because of their small size, vampires tend to restrict their attacks to small coastal fishing villages, first knocking down huts, and then setting them ablaze with their fiery breath. Vampires are not large enough to attack large cities such as Tokyo or Osaka. They are vulnerable to surface-to-ground missiles, cryo-lasers, and black hole guns. Oxygen destroyers are not effective against vampires because vampires evolved in the cold vacuum of space and therefore do not require oxygen. However, vampires do consume large volumes of helium, which accounts for the vampire's distinctively squeaky voice. If you are ever confronted by a vampire, you should swat it on one of its noses with a rolled-up newspaper or magazine, as they are afraid of newsprint. This has been Monster Chat with Dr. Edgar Fluffosaurus. Thank you for joining me.
Well, wasn't that great? I tell you, that's just the kind of A+ scholarship that you just can't find on Wikipedia. You can only find that caliber of academic accomplishment here on Spooky Tales with Steve the Cat. So yeah, that was interesting. So in the coming weeks, we will be investigating Professor Fluffosaurus's academic background and try to understand exactly where his PhD came from. But in the interim, let's talk a little more about vampires. Vampires are a staple of movies, going literally all the way back to the days of silent movies. They've been in every movie and TV environment imaginable. You're probably familiar with them already, so let's just hit a few of the high points. Vampires are undead. Their likes include blood, dark places, and gothic fashion. Their dislikes include wooden stakes, garlic, and holy water. Now, in most but not all vampire lore, vampires must be invited into your home, so they can't just sneak into your home and get you without some sort of invitation ahead of time. The most important thing about vampires, the one thing that I want you to take notes on and everybody must understand, is that vampires do not sparkle in sunlight. If there is anyone listening to this broadcast who thinks vampires sparkle in sunlight, please stop this feed now. That's just not an audience I need. Please just turn it off. Vampires do not sparkle in sunlight. So that's a little bit about vampires. So let's talk about the first film in tonight's double feature. This is a film called Eat Locals. There you see the poster right there. This is an action horror comedy. This was released in the year 2017, directed by Jason Flemyng. And the cast, it's a large cast. It includes, among others, Freema Agyeman, Charlie Cox, Eve Miles, Billy Cook, and Tony Curran. And there's a good bit to unpack here. So first of all, going through the cast, Freema Agyeman you might know from Doctor Who. She played Martha Jones, possibly the most underrated of all the Doctor's companions. Charlie Cox played Daredevil in the Netflix Daredevil series. Eve Miles was on Torchwood. And Tony Curran obviously has been in a variety of things, but you might know him most famously for his portrayal of Vincent van Gogh, again on Doctor Who. Now, Jason Flemyng you might know from his starring role in a Guy Ritchie movie called Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels. Interestingly, this movie brought together pretty much the entire cast of Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels again, either appearing on screen or behind screen. For example, Jason Statham appeared in Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels. He does not appear in Eat Locals, but I believe he was like the second unit director, so he had a job behind the scenes. So in one way or another, all the main actors from Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels are involved in this movie. So let's talk about this film a little bit. Let's do a quick film summary. This is a British horror comedy. The gist of the movie is that 8 British vampire overlords meet at a secluded farmhouse to have their once every 50 years meeting. Well, why do they have a once every 50 years meeting? That's because in order to maintain their anonymity in an increasingly technological world, vampires have adopted a strict set of rules of conduct to minimize attention. And for those that live in the UK, they have to be especially strict because, as they explain in the movie, they're an island nation, and it's a small population, and it's much more easy to get found out in this day and age. So, as part of the meeting, the vampires are discussing whether they should potentially bring in a new member to replace a member of their Council of 8 who has been breaking the rules. Now, as they're having this meeting and as these events are unfolding, the meeting is interrupted by a team of soldiers who surround the farmhouse intending to kill the vampires. So it's a play on the traditional vampires versus vampire hunters story. In this case, you have 8 modern vampires, some of which actually carry guns, being surrounded by modern-day vampire hunters who are actually soldiers. The vampires have to come up with a plan to break the blockade and escape before daybreak, otherwise, obviously, they will turn into dust and explode. This is a good comedy. It's not a great comedy, it's a good comedy. It's more witty than laugh-out-loud hilarious. If you're familiar with British comedies, then a lot of them are like that. They're just good, sensible chuckles and just some good laughs all the way through, but you're not gonna, pull a muscle because you're laughing so hard that you roll on the floor. I really enjoyed this. If you're the kind of person that really enjoys like BBC America, you will really enjoy this movie. It's a good movie. Like I said, it's not a 4-star movie. It's not the greatest movie ever made, but I really enjoyed this. I think it's worth watching. So let's talk about the villain profile. In this movie, the vampires are more or less set up as the good guys. So our villain profile for this movie is the vampire hunting soldiers. And you see one right there. They belong to a class known as Guys with Guns. Their special powers? None, other than the fact that they have a lot of guns. And rocket launchers, for example. Their signature weapon? Well, various automatic and semi-automatic firearms, and yes, I do understand the difference between the two. Their signature technique includes, well, shooting people. So that's your villain profile for Eat Locals. Alright, let's go to the scorecard for our first feature for this week, Eat Locals. Kills 26, and I've said estimated. There's a lot of action that goes on off camera in this movie. You have a lot of scenes where people run off and you hear screams. There's a lot of squads of soldiers involved, and you don't necessarily get clean counts of everything, but I came up with a count of 26, so I'm going to call that the estimated kill count for this movie. If you total up the people who die off screen, it's probably a lot more than 26. Bare breasts? None. It's not really that kind of movie. If it's really that important to you, if you watch season 1 of Sense8 on Netflix, you do get to see Freema Agyeman topless. Car chases? None. Machine gun grannies? 1. And understand, when I say machine gun grannies, I do not mean submachine gun. I do understand the difference between a submachine gun and a machine gun, and I'm telling you, she's carrying an honest-to-God, belt-fed machine gun with a bipod. So there is 1 machine gun granny in this movie. Airborne exploding poultry? 1. Adamantium buckets? 1. If you watch the movie, the bit with the bucket is pretty funny. Deadly granny walkers. Yes, Machine Gun Granny also has a deadly walker. And finally, pharmaceutical fine print that you really, really need to read closely. 1. So Steve's final score for Eat Locals, we're going to give this 2.5 paws out of 4. I flirted with giving it 3. The first time I watched this movie, I was really into it, and when I watched it the second time around, I was like, okay, maybe I was a little over-enthusiastic the first time, but it's still a good movie. So I give it 2.5 paws out of 4. I would say it's an above-average horror comedy. It's an excellent cast, and there's really good comedic chemistry, but it's more witty than laugh-out-loud funny. If that's your sort of thing, you will really enjoy this movie. If you're the kind of person that needs more belly laughs and roll-on-the-floor kind of humor, you might want to skip this one. But overall, I would say it's a good movie that it's worth watching. So that's Steve's final score for Eat Locals. All right, the second movie in our double feature for this evening is The Night Watchman. There you see the poster right there. This is a horror comedy that was released in the year 2017, directed by Mitchell Altieri, and the cast includes Ken Arnold, Dan DeLuca, Kevin Jiggets, Cara Louise, and Max Gray Wilbur. So there's the poster, and right off the bat you see that there were actually some big names associated with this on the producer side of things. I was not aware of that going into this movie. I thought it was just going to be some cheesy horror comedy that two guys had put together with a shoestring budget, and I was very wrong. This is actually a very good comedy. So let's do a quick film summary. This is a campy horror comedy about vampires running amok in Baltimore. Although it was not actually filmed in Baltimore, it was filmed in Annapolis, Maryland. I don't know exactly why that is. I assume it has to do with the fact that nobody in his right mind ever sets foot in Baltimore if they can avoid it. This is a vampire movie, but it feels like a zombie movie. It feels a lot like, say, the old Return of the Living Dead, with maybe a little bit of killer clowns from outer space thrown in. When I say it feels like a zombie movie, you know, the way zombie movies unfold is that you start with one zombie, then one becomes two, two becomes four, four becomes eight, and soon you just have a zombie horde. And this movie unfolds very similarly, that the vampires just kind of run amok, turning other people, and you have a larger and larger and larger population of vampires running amok in the city. So as the movie starts, you have an unemployed drummer with no work skills, and he joins a team of 3, shall we say, ambition-challenged night watchmen who work at the offices of a weekly tabloid magazine. Now, on his first night on the job, the body of Blimpo the Clown, a local comedy legend who recently died while on tour in Romania, is delivered to the offices by mistake. Now, there is a laboratory down the street. The coffin is delivered to the tabloid magazine instead of the laboratory by mistake. Unbeknownst to everyone in the building, Blimpo is in fact a newly sired vampire, which, you know, you can figure out because he died in Romania, and apparently everyone in Romania is a vampire. And soon the office, as well as the entire city, is overrun by a horde of vampires. This movie is very campy, and there's lots of blood, and there is a fair bit of raunchy humor. You've got flatulence humor. You've got marijuana humor, you've got poop humor, you've got a lot of different humor in this. This is a very different kind of comedy from our first movie, Eat Local. This is much more of an in-your-face belly laugh kind of movie. This movie is surprisingly well made. I found it very funny. I was very pleasantly surprised by this movie. It was much funnier and frankly, much better quality movie than I expected going in. It has a very likable cast. The 3 night watchmen remind me very much of the 3 guys that work with Paul Rudd in the Ant-Man movies. There's just a lot of good chemistry between them. They just play off each other really well. I was not familiar with Cara Louise going into this movie, but she is a great scream queen. She is like the perfect combination of tough and funny, and I would love to see her in additional movies. I just was really impressed with this movie, and maybe it's because I went into it with low expectations, thinking it was just going to be, cheesy. But I enjoyed this movie a lot. So let's talk about our villain profile. For this movie, the villain is Vampire Clowns, and there you see Blimpo the Vampire Clown right there. He belongs to the class known as Undead Circus Dwellers. Their special powers include extreme viciousness. They are practically unkillable, being vampires. They do not show up on video, which makes for some comedy in this movie when you see the contrast between what the Night Watchmen are seeing on video screens versus what is actually going on in real life. Naturally, their bite converts victims into a vampire, and, new thing that you might learn about vampires in this movie, they have intense defensive flatulence. Their signature weapon is nasty big vampire clown teeth. And their signature technique is neck nibbling with their nasty big vampire clown teeth. So that's the villain profile for the Night Watchmen. Alright, let's go to the scorecard for our second feature for this evening, the Night Watchmen. Kills. I'm going to count it as 26 plus many more. So why does it say 26 plus many more? Well, I was taking a nice tally. I got up to 26, and then without spoiling anything for you, an event unfolds which escalates the kill count dramatically and basically made it impossible for me to count anymore. So we're going to say 26 plus many more. Bare breasts, 6, plus there's some additional locker porn and TV monitor porn. Denogginings, yeah, there is one of those. Ensnappinatings, or hoot owlings if you prefer, there is one of those. Human bowling. There are 2 different incidents of human bowling in this movie. Cougar vampire booby squeezes. Now understand, when I say cougar vampire, I do not mean a vampire of a predatory cat. I mean a vampire of a predatory human female of a certain age. 1. That's one occurrence. It's actually 2 boobies, 2 hands, but 1 occurrence. Honestly, I'm not sure how to score this. The rules on this are kind of elastic. This is not something we have to deal with very often when scoring movies for Steve's scorecard, so just kind of go with it. And finally, rich guys in suits who discover why rich guys in suits don't walk their dogs after dark in downtown Baltimore. 1. Yeah, this is possibly the most realistic thing in the history of movie making. A effete, wealthy man walking his little foofy dog after dark in downtown Baltimore is immediately killed. Now, understand, in the movie, he's immediately killed by a clown vampire, but in real life, he would be immediately killed just by something much more mundane. Steve the Cat headquarters is located in Northern Virginia, so I am not too terribly far from Baltimore, so I am fairly familiar with Baltimore. In my previous career, I had the pleasure of living in the general vicinity of Detroit, so I've had my sampling of Detroit and Baltimore, and let me tell you, if you want to understand Baltimore, start with Detroit and take away the economic prosperity and the competent governance. Baltimore is not a place you want to go. But with your viewing of The Night Watchmen, you also get some bonus features, such as vampire flatulence. Although I can't be sure that it's only flatulence, if you get my drift. The world's worst shot. Ken Arnold with a handgun is just hilarious. The world's worst beatboxer. Kevin Jiggett's beatboxing, even more hilarious than Ken Arnold with a handgun. You get vampires hate meatball subs. At least they hate really good ones. You'll understand that when you watch the movie. That did not happen on True Blood. I watched every season. You have an 80s or maybe 90s style rock montage, which I just love. I love the tribute to the old school horror movies when they have like an 80s style rock montage in a modern movie. It was so great. You get a vampire girl-on-girl makeout session. Yes, you read that right. You get a vampire girl-on-girl makeout session. And finally, you have a man bun. How can you be self-conscious? So Steve's final score for The Night Watchmen. We're gonna give this 3 paws out of 4. It is a surprisingly enjoyable horror comedy with a lot of humor and a really likable cast. And this feels like a throwback to the old Return of the Living Dead, which for me is a huge plus. I have very fond memories of going to see Return of the Living Dead in its original theatrical release back when I was much younger, and it was just so funny. This movie reminds me of Return of the Living Dead in all the right ways. So that's Steve's final score for The Night Watchman. So we're almost to the end of yet another episode, but before we go, let's talk about some other stuff Steve watched this week. Number 1, Hostel Part 3. I wasn't even aware until recently that they had made a Hostel Part 3, so I had to watch it. This is a follow-up to Eli Roth's torture porn classic about a club of wealthy elitists who pay to torture and murder tourists. Now, in this chapter, we're dealing with a different branch of the Hunters Club. We're dealing with a branch that's located in Las Vegas. So instead of being over in Eastern Europe, we are now in the United States in Las Vegas with a different branch of the Hunters Club. That said, no. Run far away. Do not look back. This movie was not actually directed by Eli Roth. It is awful. And the thing is, it's boring. It's boring, and apart from the first killing, and if you're not a torture porn fan, just tune out for a second, but if you're looking for torture porn, there's really not a whole lot of occurring in this movie. The killings are actually really mundane, with the exception of the very first one. It's like they only had a tiny bit of money to throw at the special effects budget, and so they spent that on the very first killing, and after that it was things like, a guy strapped to a chair and he gets shot with a crossbow a few times. I mean, sure, it's terrible to see somebody killed, but it's not really what you would expect in a torture porn kind of movie. So, no, there's nothing redeeming about this one, just no. Second movie, Metal Face. Yeah, a guy in a mask kills people while another guy watches on camera. Probably the most notably interesting thing about this movie is that the filmmakers honestly thought that, yeah, we're going to do 20 minutes of this movie where we show the lead character driving someplace. Now understand, this is not driving someplace while they give exposition about the character or the story. It's just like 20 minutes of somebody driving someplace and worrying that she's not going to have enough gas once she gets there. And once she finally gets there, she's out of gas and she's very stressed out. But the people that she's there to meet do show up in a four-wheeler, and so there's another 5 minutes of her riding along in a four-wheeler. This is some god-awful filmmaking. It's just people riding around in vehicles. Run far away. Avoid Metal Face at all costs. Number 3, Goddess of Love. In this movie, a ridiculously beautiful woman descends into madness and obsession over a new boyfriend. Now, if you've seen enough movies like this, you kind of know how it's going to unfold. You watch things happen, and you tell yourself, okay, at the end of the movie, we'll find out which of those things actually happened for real and which only happened in her head. It's not really a horror movie. It showed up in my queue, listed as a horror movie, when I was looking at movies on Tubi, but it is not really a horror movie. It's more of a thriller with a couple of violent moments, so I understand why they may have tagged it as a horror movie in the metadata because of 1 or 2 scenes, but for the most part, this is more Fatal Attraction than Friday the 13th. That said, it's not a bad movie, it's not a good movie, it's very mediocre if you know what you're in for and you're okay with that. If you're okay with a low-budget, unknown actor, Fatal Attraction kind of remake, fine. If you're looking for an actual horror movie, you want to stay away from this one, not because it's necessarily a terrible movie, just because it's not really what you're looking for. So it was kind of a tough week at Steve the Cat headquarters this week. Definitely avoid Hostel Part 3. Definitely avoid Metal Face. Goddess of Love, only if you're really looking for an erotic thriller kind of thing with just a little bit of violence. Otherwise, I can't really recommend any of these. So that is a very disappointing week of other stuff Steve watched this week. Well, that brings us to the close of another episode of Spooky Tales with Steve the Cat. Join us again next week. We're hoping to score an interview with the demon Beelzebub because it turns out he inhabits the body of the drummer for a Chuck E. Cheese band in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. In the meantime, be good to each other, have a great week, and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye. Steve, you have been more camera shy than usual this week. Anything you'd like to add? No? I guess that's everything. Thanks for watching.